My name is Virginia Harris, but everyone calls me Ginny, and at 67 years old, I thought I knew everything there was to know about my husband of 42 years. I thought David was the man who would hold my hand through anything, who would fight for me when I couldn't fight for myself. I was wrong, dead wrong. And I discovered just how wrong I was on the worst day of my life, when I was lying in a hospital bed, half my face drooping, struggling to form words, and he stood in the hallway outside my room telling the insurance adjuster, "She'll be fine, she always bounces back, we don't need to rush into anything expensive." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I had always been the strong one in our marriage. When David lost his job at the manufacturing plant, I picked up extra shifts at the county clerk's office. When his mother needed care, I rearranged my schedule to drive her to appointments. When he wanted to start his landscaping business but had no credit, I cosigned every loan. For 4 decades, I had been his safety net, his support system, his cheerleader. I never imagined that when I finally needed him to be mine, he would see me as nothing more than a liability. The stroke happened on a Tuesday morning in March. I remember because I had been planning to plant my spring bulbs that afternoon. I was standing at the kitchen sink washing the breakfast dishes and humming along to the radio, when suddenly the world tilted sideways. The coffee mug slipped from my hand and shattered against the porcelain, but I barely heard it. My left arm felt like it had fallen asleep, heavy and useless, and when I tried to call out to David, who was reading the paper at the kitchen table, my words came out slurred and wrong. David looked up from his newspaper with annoyance, like I was interrupting something important. "What's wrong with you?" he asked, and there was impatience in his voice, not concern. I tried to tell him I couldn't feel my arm, that something was terribly wrong, but the words tangled on my tongue. That's when his expression changed, not to worry or fear, but to something that looked almost like inconvenience. The ambulance ride was a blur of sirens and strangers asking me to squeeze their hands, to follow their fingers with my eye. David rode in the front seat, not beside me, and I remember thinking through the fog in my brain that he should be holding my hand, that he should be telling me everything would be okay. Instead, I heard him on his phone, his voice calm and businesslike, talking to someone about canceling his afternoon appointments. At the hospital, everything moved fast and slow at the same time. There were CT scans and blood tests, and doctors with serious faces, who used words I couldn't quite process. David stood against the wall with his arms crossed, answering their questions about my medical history in a tone that suggested this was all very inconvenient timing. When the neurologist explained that I had suffered a moderate ischemic stroke, that the next 48 hours would be critical for my recovery, David nodded like he was receiving a weather report. They admitted me to the stroke unit, a sterile place that smelled like disinfectant, and my room was small with one window that looked out onto the hospital parking lot, and a television mounted on the wall that I couldn't focus on anyway. David helped me into the hospital gown, but his hands were perfunctory, efficient, like he was handling a task he wanted to finish quickly. When the nurse asked if I had any questions, I looked at David, hoping he would ask the things I couldn't form words for, but he was already checking his watch. The first night was the longest of my life. My speech was slurred, my left side weak, and every time I tried to call for help, the words came out garbled and strange. David had gone home to take care of things, leaving me alone with the beeping machines and the fluorescent lights that never quite turned off. I lay there staring at the ceiling, terrified that this was my new reality, that I would never again be the competent, independent woman I had always been. When David returned the next morning, he brought coffee for himself but nothing for me. He sat in the uncomfortable chair beside my bed and immediately pulled out his phone, scrolling through emails like I wasn't even there. When Dr. Martinez, my neurologist, came in to discuss my condition, David finally looked up, but his first question wasn't about my prognosis or my pain. It was about how long I would need to stay in the hospital. Dr. Martinez explained that strokes affected everyone differently, that my recovery would depend on many factors, including the rehabilitation services I receive. He mentioned physical therapy, speech therapy, occupational therapy, all the support I would need to regain my independence. David listened with the expression of someone calculating costs in his head. When the doctor finished, David asked about the most economical treatment option. I felt something cold settle in my stomach that had nothing to do with my medical condition. This was my husband of 42 years, the man I had stood beside through every crisis, every setback, every challenge, and he was shopping for the cheapest way to deal with my stroke, like I was a broken appliance. He was deciding whether to repair or replace. The real revelation came on my third day in the hospital. I had been dozing fitfully when I heard voices in the hallway outside my room. The door was slightly ajar, and I recognized David's voice immediately. He was talking to someone, his tone more animated than it had been since my stroke began. Curious and still groggy from medication, I strained to listen. "Look, she's always been dramatic about medical stuff," David was saying. "Last year she went to the emergency room because she thought she was having a heart attack, and it turned out to be heartburn. She'll be fine, she always bounces back. We don't need to rush into anything expensive." My heart started pounding so hard I thought it might trigger another stroke. He was talking to someone about me, about my condition, like I was malingering or exaggerating. I heard a woman's voice respond, something about coverage and approvals, and I realized he was talking to someone from our insurance company. "The doctors are just covering themselves legally," David continued. "You know how they are, they want to do every test, every therapy. Rack up the bills, but Ginny's tough. She doesn't need all that fancy rehabilitation stuff. She can recover just as well at home." The woman asked something about my current condition, and David's response made my blood turn to ice. "She's being a little dramatic, playing up the symptoms. The speech thing comes and goes, and the weakness in her arm isn't as bad as she makes it seem. She's always been good at getting attention when she wants it." I lay there in that hospital bed, tethered to machines that monitored my vital signs, my face still drooping on one side, my words still thick and clumsy, and listened to my husband tell an insurance representative that I was faking the severity of my stroke. The man I had trusted with my life, my heart, my future, was actively undermining my medical care to save money. The conversation continued, and I heard David agree to something about managing costs and keeping treatment minimal. When he mentioned that I had always been strong and would bounce back without all the fuss, I finally understood what was happening. He wasn't trying to help me recover. He was trying to minimize the financial impact of my stroke on our household budget. When David walked back into my room a few minutes later, I was lying with my eyes closed, pretending to sleep. He settled back into his chair and resumed scrolling through his phone, completely unaware that I had just heard him dismiss my medical emergency as attention-seeking behavior. I kept my breathing steady and my face blank, but inside, something fundamental had shifted. For the first time in our marriage, I was seeing David clearly, without the filter of love and loyalty that had obscured his true nature for decades. Over the next few days, I started paying attention to things I had never noticed before. When the physical therapist came to work with me, David always found an excuse to step out of the room. When the speech pathologist explained exercises I could do to regain my verbal clarity, David nodded politely but never asked questions or offered to help me practice. When the occupational therapist talked about modifications we could make at home to help me navigate daily tasks, David's response was always the same. "She won't need that. She's tougher than she looks." The nursing staff began to notice too. I caught sympathetic looks from the women who helped me with basic tasks, the ones who saw how David interacted with me when he thought no one was watching. There was no tenderness in his touch, no warmth in his voice. He handled me like I was an obligation, something to be managed efficiently until it was no longer his problem. On my 5th day in the hospital, Dr. Martinez sat down with both of us to discuss my discharge plan. My speech had improved slightly, though I still struggled with complex words, and I had regained some strength in my left arm, though it remained significantly weaker than before. The doctor explained that I would need several months of intensive rehabilitation to maximize my recovery, that the first year after a stroke was critical for regaining lost function. David listened with visible impatience. checking his watch repeatedly. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. When Dr. Jimenez finished outlining the recommended treatment plan, David's first comment was about our insurance coverage. He wanted to know what the minimum required services were, what we could skip without legal consequences, how quickly I could be considered stable enough to manage with minimal professional help. Dr. Martinez looked uncomfortable. "Miss Harris," he said carefully, "your wife has suffered a significant neurological event. The rehabilitation isn't optional. It's essential for her recovery and her quality of life. Without proper therapy, she could face permanent limitations that might have been preventable." David shrugged. "She's a fighter. She'll figure it out." I felt the last piece of my illusion about my marriage crumble away. This man, who had promised to love me in sickness and in health, was essentially condemning me to a diminished life, because proper medical care was inconvenient and expensive. He wasn't my partner in this crisis. He was my adversary. That night, alone in my hospital room, I made a decision that would change everything. I was not going to accept David's version of my recovery. I was not going to allow him to minimize my needs or sabotage my rehabilitation. And I was certainly not going to spend whatever years I had left being treated like a burden by the man who was supposed to love me most. But I was also smart enough to know that challenging David directly in my current weakened state would be pointless. He held all the cards: our finances, our insurance, our home. If I was going to fight back, I needed to be strategic. I needed to appear compliant while I figured out how to protect myself. The next morning, when David arrived with his usual coffee and distracted demeanor, I smiled at him as warmly as I could manage. "Thank you for being here," I said, my words still slightly slurred but clear enough. "I know this is hard on you too." He looked surprised by my gratitude, like he had expected me to be more demanding. "It's fine," he said, settling into his chair. "We'll get through this." "I've been thinking," I continued, working to keep my voice steady. "Maybe you're right about the rehabilitation. Maybe I don't need all those fancy therapies. Maybe I can recover just fine at home with you." David's face brightened for the first time since my stroke. "That's what I've been trying to tell you. You're stronger than these doctors think. You always have been." I nodded, letting him believe I was coming around to his way of thinking. But inside I was already planning. I might have lost some of my physical capabilities, but my mind was as sharp as ever, and I was about to use every bit of intelligence I had to make sure that David's betrayal would cost him far more than my medical care ever could. The discharge planning meeting was scheduled for the following afternoon. David had already made it clear that he intended to decline most of the recommended services, to take me home and handle my recovery naturally. He had no idea that I had been making plans of my own, that I had been thinking about things he couldn't imagine I knew about. Because David had made one crucial mistake in his calculations. He had assumed that 42 years of being the supportive, accommodating wife meant I was naive about our finances, about our assets, about the life we had built together. He had forgotten that I had worked in the county clerk's office for 30 years, that I understood legal documents and property records, and the intricate ways that money and power moved through official channels. More importantly, he had forgotten about the safety deposit box I had opened 15 years ago, the one I had never mentioned to him, the one that contained copies of every important document in our lives, and a few things he didn't know existed. The key was hidden in my jewelry box, behind a loose panel I had installed myself. David had never been curious enough about my jewelry to examine the box closely. As I lay in that hospital bed, he saw me as an extension of himself, a resource to be managed, a problem to be solved as cheaply and efficiently as possible. "What if the doctors are right?" I asked. "What if I do have permanent limitations without proper therapy?" David shrugged. Actually shrugged, like my potential disability was a minor inconvenience. "Then we'll deal with it. People adapted before all these fancy medical treatments existed. You'll figure it out." The casual dismissal of my future, of my quality of life, of my fundamental right to recovery, crystallized everything I had been feeling since I overheard his conversation at the hospital. David wasn't trying to protect our finances from medical expenses. He was protecting his lifestyle from the inconvenience of having a wife who needed care. Is this about money? I asked, directly. Are we having financial problems I don't know about? For the first time in the conversation, David looked uncomfortable. He glanced away, picked up his coffee cup, set it down again. It's not about problems, he said finally. It's about being responsible. Medical costs can get out of control fast. We need to be careful. Careful with what? Our savings? Our retirement accounts? The life insurance policies? David, I don't even know how much money we have. You've always handled all of that. His discomfort deepened. You don't need to worry about the details. I've got it under control. But I was tired of not worrying about the details. Tired of trusting someone else to make decisions about my life without my input. My stroke had taught me that my health, my future, my very survival could not be left in the hands of someone who saw me as expendable. I want to see our financial statements, I said. I want to understand exactly what we can and can't afford. David's reaction was immediate and telling. Why? You've never been interested in that stuff before. You've always been happy to let me handle it. Because I need to understand what's at stake, I said. Because this is my recovery we're talking about. My quality of life. My future. I think I have a right to know what resources are available to help me get better. David stood up abruptly, pushing his chair back from the table. This is exactly what I was afraid of, he said. The stroke has made you paranoid and suspicious. You're not thinking clearly. The accusation hung in the air between us like a challenge. David was suggesting that my desire to understand our finances, my questions about my medical care, my refusal to accept his dismissive attitude about my recovery were all symptoms of brain damage rather than legitimate concern. I felt the last vestiges of my willingness to accommodate him disappear. I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years, I said. And what I'm thinking is that my husband is more concerned about saving money than about his wife's recovery from a major medical emergency. David's face flushed red. That's not fair. I've been here. I've taken care of you. You've managed me, I corrected, like a problem to be solved, not like a person to be cared for. There's a difference. We stared at each other across the kitchen table, 42 years of marriage suddenly feeling like a chasm neither of us could cross. David had expected me to be grateful for his minimal efforts, to accept his financial priorities without question, to trust his judgment about my own medical needs. I had expected him to fight for my recovery the way I had fought for everything that mattered to him. I'm going to call the rehabilitation center tomorrow, I said quietly. I'm going to schedule the appointments the doctor recommended. David's jaw tightened. No, you're not. We can't afford it, and you don't need it. How do you know we can't afford it? Show me the number. Show me our bank statements, our insurance policy, our investment accounts. Prove to me that my recovery is going to bankrupt us. David looked like I had asked him to reveal state secrets. You don't understand how complicated this stuff is. Just trust me to handle it. But I was done trusting him to handle things that affected my life. My stroke had shown me how quickly everything could change, how vulnerable I could become, how much I needed to take responsibility for my own well-being. David had proven that he couldn't be counted on to prioritize my needs when they conflicted with his convenience. I'm not asking you to explain it to me, I said. I'm asking you to show me, tonight, right now. I want to see where we stand financially. David crossed his arms over his chest, his expression stubborn and defensive. I'm not going to let you make financial decisions when you're not thinking straight. The stroke affected your judgment. There it was, out in the open. David's true position. He believed that my stroke had made me incompetent to participate in decisions about my own life, that my desire for proper medical care was evidence of impaired thinking, that his role was to protect our assets from my unreasonable demand. I stood up slowly, my legs still unsteady but my resolve absolutely firm. David, I said, I want you to listen to me very carefully. I am going to recover from this stroke. I am going to get the medical care I need, and I am going to make my own decisions about my life from now on. You can either support me in that, or you can get out of my way. David's laugh was ugly, dismissive. Get out of your way, Ginny. You can barely make it up the stairs without getting winded. You can't drive. You can't work. You can barely take care of yourself. What exactly do you think you're going to do? His words were meant to hurt, to remind me of my limitations, to put me back in the diminished place he thought I belonged, but they had the opposite effect. They clarified exactly what I was up against, exactly how little David thought of me, exactly how far I would have to go to reclaim my life. I guess we'll find out, I said. That night, I lay in bed listening to David snore beside me, his sleep untroubled by our conversation. He had dismissed my concerns so completely that he probably thought the matter was settled, that I would wake up in the morning ready to accept his version of my recovery. He was wrong. I stared at the ceiling in the darkness, thinking about the safety deposit box I had never mentioned to him, about the documents and information I had access to, about the life I had built before I became David's accommodating wife. I thought about the woman I had been at the county clerk's office, competent and respected, and quietly powerful in ways David had never bothered to understand. That woman was still here, still intact, despite the damage to my brain. And that woman was about to remind David that underestimating her had always been a mistake. My stroke had taken some things from me, but it had also given me something I had lost years ago, the absolute clarity that comes from seeing someone's true character revealed in a crisis. David had shown me exactly who he was when I needed him most. Now I was going to show him exactly who I was when I stopped trying to be who he wanted me to be. The next morning, I waited until David left for work. Then I called my friend Martha, who had worked with me at the county office before we both retired. Martha had always been discreet and resourceful, and I knew she would help me without asking too many questions. "Ginny," she said when she heard my voice, "how are you feeling? I heard about your stroke from Helen. I've been meaning to call. I'm recovering," I said carefully. "Martha, I need a favor. I need someone to drive me to the bank this afternoon. David thinks I'm not ready to go out alone yet." There was a pause, and I could hear the questions Martha wasn't asking. "Of course," she said finally. "What time?" 2 o'clock. "I'll explain when I see you." Martha arrived promptly at 2, her face full of concern and curiosity. She hugged me carefully like she was afraid I might break, and helped me into her car. During the drive to the bank, I told her about David's attitude toward my recovery, about his refusal to let me see our financial information, about his determination to minimize my medical care. Martha listened without comment until I finished, then shook her head slowly. "Ginny," she said, "in all the years I've known you, you've never asked for help unless you really needed it. Whatever you're planning, I'm here for you." At the bank, I walked slowly to the safety deposit box area, my heart pounding with anticipation and fear. It had been months since I had visited the box, but the key was exactly where I had left it, taped to the inside of my jewelry case behind the false panel I had installed years ago. Inside the safety deposit box were documents David didn't know existed, information I had gathered over the years as insurance against a future I had hoped would never come, copies of all our financial statements, property deeds, insurance policies, investment records. But more importantly, there were documents that would surprise David very much. The inheritance from my Aunt Ruth, the one David thought had been a few $1,000s, had actually been substantial. I had quietly invested the money over the years, building a portfolio that was entirely in my name. The small consulting work I had done after retirement, helping other counties modernize their record-keeping systems, had been more lucrative than David knew. I had been financially independent for years, but I had never had reason to assert that independence. Until now, I also found the folder I had hoped I would never need to open. Private investigator reports from 5 years ago, when I had suspected David of having an affair. The affair had ended, and I had chosen to forgive him, but I had kept the evidence. Photos, credit card statements, hotel receipts, phone records, proof of expenses and deceptions that David thought were buried in the past. Martha waited in the car while I organized the documents I needed, making copies of everything important. When I returned, she could see that something had changed in my expression, something had shifted in my posture. "Did you find what you were looking for?" she asked. "I found more than I was looking for," I said. "Martha, I'm going to need your help with something else, something bigger." She looked at me with the same expression she had worn during our most challenging days at the county office, when we had faced impossible deadlines and demanding officials and somehow found ways to get the job done. "What do you need?" she asked. I smiled for the first time since my stroke, a real smile that felt like the beginning of something new. "I need to remind my husband who he married," I said, "and I need to show him what it costs when you bet against the wrong person." That evening, David came home expecting to find the same diminished woman he had left that morning, the one who accepted his financial decisions without question, who believed his assertions about what she did and didn't need for her recovery. Instead, he found me sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of papers in front of me, and an expression he hadn't seen in years. "We need to talk," I said, and this time, I was going to do most of the talking. David stood in the kitchen doorway, his work boots still muddy from the job site, staring at me with the kind of confusion people show when familiar territory suddenly becomes foreign. The stack of papers in front of me might as well have been written in a language he didn't understand, which in a way they were. They were written in the language of financial independence, of careful planning, of a woman who had been preparing for possibilities her husband never imagined. "What's all this?" he asked, settling into his usual chair, but keeping his distance from the documents spread across our kitchen table. I picked up the top sheet, a bank statement showing an account balance that would make David's landscaping business look like pocket change. "This is our conversation about money," I said, my voice steadier than it had been since my stroke, "the one you've been avoiding." David reached for the paper, but I held it back. "Before you look at anything, I want you to understand something. You've spent the last week telling me what we can and can't afford, making decisions about my medical care based on financial constraints you refuse to explain. You've treated me like I'm too fragile or too stupid to understand our situation. That ends now." I slid the bank statement across the table. David's eyes moved across the numbers, and I watched his face change as the reality sank in. The account showed $847,000 in readily available funds, money that had been accumulating for 15 years from investments he didn't know I had made. "Where did this come from?" he asked, his voice tight. "My inheritance from Aunt Ruth, the one you assumed was a couple $1,000s. I placed another document in front of him, investment statements showing how that money has grown over the year. Carefully managed, conservatively invested, completely separate from our joint accounts." David studied the papers like they were evidence in a crime he was being accused of. "You never told me about this. You never asked. When Aunt Ruth died, you said you were sorry for my loss, and asked if there was enough money to pay for the funeral. I said yes, and you never mentioned it again. You assumed it was a small amount, because that's what you wanted to assume." I reached into my folder and pulled out more documents. "Here's the income from my consulting work, the county modernization projects I worked on after retirement. You thought I was volunteering my time, doing busy work to keep myself occupied. Actually, I was earning between $50,000 and $75,000 per project." David's hands shook slightly as he examined the consulting contracts, the payment records, the tax documents I had filed separately. "You've been hiding money from me for years." "I've been managing my own money for years," I corrected. "There's a difference. Everything in our joint accounts, everything we've built together, I've been completely honest about, but my inheritance and my earnings from work you never took seriously, those stayed mine." I could see David's mind working, recalculating our financial situation, reassessing every conversation we'd had about money over the past 15 years. He was realizing that the woman he thought was financially dependent on him had actually been financially independent all along. "How much?" he asked quietly. I placed a summary sheet in front of him, the one I had prepared that afternoon with Martha's help. "Total liquid assets in my name only, $1.2 million. Total investment portfolio value, another $800,000. Property investments you don't know about, 3 rental units in the next county, fully paid off, generating monthly income." David stared at the numbers like they were written in a foreign language. "Property invest." "Remember when I used to drive to Millfield once a month to visit my cousin Clara? I wasn't just visiting, I was building a real estate portfolio. Small houses, good neighborhoods, reliable renters. Clara helped me find the properties and manage them locally." I watched David process this information, watched him realize that his financially dependent wife had been quietly building wealth, while he assumed she was making social visits. The power dynamic in our marriage had just shifted in a way he never could have anticipated. "Why?" he asked finally. "Why keep it secret?"
I leaned back in my chair feeling stronger than I had since my stroke, because I learned a long time ago that financial independence gives you options, because I watched my mother stay in a bad marriage for 40 years, because she couldn't afford to leave, because I wanted to know that if something ever happened to you, or to us, I could take care of myself. David's face was pale now, the implications sinking in. You were planning to leave me. I wasn't planning anything specific. I was planning for the possibility that you might become ill and unable to work, the possibility that your business might fail, the possibility that we might grow old and need expensive care. I paused, looking directly at him. The possibility that you might turn out to be someone I didn't recognize when I needed you most. The silence stretched between us, heavy with years of assumptions and misconceptions. David had built his sense of control in our marriage on the belief that I was financially vulnerable, that my choices were limited by my dependence on his income and his management of our resources. Now he was discovering that the foundation of that control had been an illusion. This changes things, he said slowly. Yes, it does. It means that when you tell me we can't afford proper rehabilitation therapy, you're either lying, or you don't understand our actual financial situation. It means that when you make unilateral decisions about my medical care, based on cost, you're doing it by choice, not necessity. I pulled out another set of documents. These ones David would recognize, copies of our joint bank statements, our shared investment accounts, our insurance policy. These are our joint assets, the ones you manage. Would you like to explain to me why you've been so concerned about the cost of my medical care, when our combined resources could easily handle any reasonable treatment plan? David picked up our joint account statements, scanning numbers he knew by heart. Our shared savings alone were substantial, nearly $400,000 accumulated over decades of careful living and his successful landscaping business. Combined with my separate assets, we had resources that most families could only dream of. It's not about the money, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Then what is it about? Help me understand why you've been so determined to minimize my recovery, to convince me I don't need proper medical care, to handle my stroke as cheaply as possible. David set down the papers and rubbed his forehead, a gesture I had seen countless times when he was trying to avoid a difficult conversation, but this time I wasn't going to let him retreat into silence or deflection. David, I heard you on the phone at the hospital. I heard you tell the insurance company that I was being dramatic, that I was exaggerating my symptoms, that I didn't need expensive rehabilitation. I heard you dismiss my stroke as attention-seeking behavior. His head snapped up, guilt and anger warring in his expression. You were sleeping. I was listening, and what I heard was my husband of 42 years, telling a stranger that his wife was faking the severity of a brain injury to get attention. What I heard was someone more concerned about insurance rates than about his wife's recovery. David's face flushed red. That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? Explain it to me. Make me understand how telling an insurance adjuster that I'm dramatic and don't need proper medical care was somehow in my best interest. David stood up abruptly, pacing to the kitchen window and back. You don't understand how insurance companies work. They look for any excuse to deny coverage or drop policies. If they think you're a high-risk case, it affects everything. So you decided to minimize my condition to protect our insurance rate. I decided to be strategic about how we presented your case. There's a difference. I felt the familiar anger rising, but this time, it was accompanied by something else. Clarity. Cold, sharp clarity about exactly who my husband was and what motivated him. Strategic, I repeated. You were strategic about my brain injury. You made calculated decisions about my medical care based on insurance considerations, without consulting me, without even telling me what you were doing.
I was protecting our interests, David said, but he couldn't meet my eyes. Whose interests? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you were protecting your convenience and your budget at the expense of my health. I reached into my folder again and pulled out the final set of documents, the ones I had hoped I would never need to use. Since we're talking about being strategic, let me show you what strategic really looks like. The first document was a credit card statement from 5 years ago, showing charges at hotels and restaurants during times when David had told me he was working late or traveling for business. The second was a series of photographs taken by a private investigator, showing David with a woman I didn't recognize, entering and leaving locations that had nothing to do with landscaping. David went very still when he saw the photos. "Where did you get these?" "From the investigator I hired when I suspected you were having an affair. The same investigator who documented your activities for 3 months, who provided detailed reports of your movements, your expenses, your meetings with Linda Morrison." David sank back into his chair, the fight going out of him. "That was years ago. That's over. I know it's over. I chose to forgive you and work on our marriage. But I didn't choose to forget, and I didn't choose to trust blindly ever again." I arranged the photographs in a neat row across the table. "These represent approximately $15,000 in expenses you charged to our joint credit card while you were having an affair. Dinners, hotels, gifts, weekend trips you told me were business-related." David stared at the evidence of his infidelity, photographs that captured moments he thought were private and forgotten. "Why are you bringing this up now? I thought we moved past this." "We did move past it. But these documents represent something important about your character, David. They show that when it serves your purposes, you're perfectly willing to lie to me, to hide things from me, to make decisions that affect our marriage without my knowledge or consent." I picked up one of the hotel receipts, examining it like I was seeing it for the first time. "You spent more money on one weekend with Linda Morrison than you're willing to spend on a month of rehabilitation therapy for my stroke recovery. You had no problem with expensive dinners and luxury hotels when you were pursuing another woman, but physical therapy for your wife's brain injury is too costly to consider." The comparison hung in the air between us, stark and undeniable. David had been willing to spend our joint resources on his affair, but he considered my medical needs an unnecessary expense. "That's not the same thing," David said weakly. "Isn't it? In both cases you made financial decisions that affected our marriage without consulting me. In both cases you prioritized your wants over my needs. In both cases you lied to me about what you were doing and why." I gathered the photographs and receipts into a neat stack. "The difference is that 5 years ago, I chose to focus on saving our marriage. Today I'm choosing to focus on saving myself." David looked up sharply. "What does that mean?" I reached into my folder one final time and pulled out a business card. "This is Rebecca Chen, an attorney who specializes in elder law and healthcare advocacy. I'm meeting with her tomorrow to discuss my options for ensuring I receive appropriate medical care, regardless of your opinions about what I do or don't need." David's face went white. "You're threatening to sue me." "I'm not threatening anything. I'm informing you that I'm taking control of my own healthcare decisions. Rebecca will help me understand my rights as a stroke patient, my options for rehabilitation services, and the legal protections available to ensure I receive appropriate care." I stood up slowly, my legs still unsteady but my resolve absolutely firm. "I'm also meeting with a financial advisor to discuss separating our assets in a way that protects my ability to pay for my own medical care, without interference from anyone who might have different priorities." David shot to his feet. "You can't do that. We're married. Those are joint assets. Some of them are joint assets. Many of them, as you've just discovered, are not. And even joint assets can be restructured when one spouse is making decisions that endanger the other's health and welfare." I gathered the documents from the table, organizing them back into my folder with the methodical precision I had learned during 30 years of managing records at the county office. "David, you made a calculation about my stroke. You decided that minimizing my care was more important than maximizing my recovery. You thought I was too weak, too confused, too dependent to challenge your decision." I looked at him directly, letting him see the strength that my stroke hadn't touched, the competence that his dismissive attitude couldn't diminish. "You calculated wrong." David's face cycled through several emotions: confusion, anger, fear, and something that might have been "What do you want from me?" "I want you to understand that the woman you married 42 years ago is still here. The woman who built a career, who managed complex systems, who solved problems and made decisions, and took care of herself long before she took care of you. My stroke affected my mobility and my speech, but it didn't affect my intelligence, or my judgment, or my right to proper medical care." I moved toward the kitchen door, then turned back to face him. I want you to decide whether you're going to support my recovery or continue to sabotage it. Because those are your only options now. The option of controlling my healthcare decisions without my consent is no longer available to you. David stood in the middle of our kitchen, surrounded by evidence of financial resources he hadn't known existed, and past deceptions he thought were buried, looking like a man who had just discovered that the ground he was standing on was quicksand. I need time to think. He said. Take all the time you need, I replied, but understand that while you're thinking, I'm moving forward. Tomorrow I'm meeting with Rebecca Chen. Next week I'm starting the rehabilitation therapy the doctor recommended. I'm going to recover from my stroke properly, completely, and professionally, regardless of your concerns about cost or convenience. I headed toward the stairs, then paused at the bottom step. Oh, and David? I'm having the locks changed tomorrow. From now on, my medical information, my financial documents, and my personal space are private unless I choose to share them. If you want to be part of my recovery, you're welcome. If you want to continue treating me like a financial liability instead of your wife, you can find somewhere else to do it. That night, I lay in bed, listening to David move around downstairs, opening and closing cabinets, pacing from room to room. I could hear him on his phone, his voice low and urgent, though I couldn't make out the word. He was probably calling his brother, or his best friend, trying to make sense of what had just happened, trying to figure out how his compliant, financially dependent wife had suddenly become someone he didn't recognize. But I was exactly who I had always been. The only thing that had changed was my willingness to let him pretend otherwise. I thought about the meeting I had scheduled with Rebecca Chen, about the conversation I would have with my financial advisor, about the rehabilitation therapy I would begin whether David approved or not. For the first time since my stroke, I felt hopeful about my recovery, not just the physical recovery, but the recovery of the woman I had been before I became so focused on being the wife David wanted. My stroke had taken some things from me, but it had also given me something I had lost years ago: the absolute clarity that comes from seeing your life without illusions. David had shown me exactly who he was when I was at my most vulnerable. Now I was going to show him exactly who I was when I stopped accommodating his version of who I should be. The next morning, David was gone when I woke up. No note, no explanation, just his coffee cup in the sink and his truck missing from the driveway. I wasn't surprised. David had always been someone who avoided difficult conversations by disappearing until he thought the crisis had passed. But this crisis wasn't going to pass. This was the new normal, and the sooner he accepted that, the better off we would both be. I called Martha to drive me to my appointment with Rebecca Chen, then spent the morning organizing the documents I would need: medical records, insurance policies, financial statements, evidence of David's attempts to minimize my care. I was building a case for my right to proper treatment, my competence to make my own healthcare decisions, and my financial ability to pay for whatever services I needed. Rebecca Chen's office was in a converted Victorian house downtown, the kind of place that felt more like a home than a business. Rebecca herself was younger than I had expected, probably in her 40s, with the kind of direct gaze that suggested she had heard every excuse and seen every form of family dysfunction imaginable. She listened without interruption as I explained my situation, taking notes in a precise hand while I described David's behavior at the hospital, his conversations with insurance representatives, his refusal to support recommended rehabilitation services. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and studied me with frank assessment. "Mrs. Harris," she said, "what you're describing is a form of financial abuse. When a spouse deliberately interferes with necessary medical care for economic reasons, especially when the family has adequate resources to pay for that care, it's considered a form of domestic abuse." I had never thought of David's behavior in those terms, but hearing it labeled clearly made something click into place. "What are my options?" I asked. Rebecca opened a thick folder and began pulling out documents. "Several options, depending on how far you want to take. At the minimum, we can establish a healthcare directive that gives you sole authority over your medical decisions. We can also set up a separate account,
specifically for medical expenses that your husband cannot access or control. She slid a document across the desk. If you want to go further, we can petition the court for a protective order that prevents your husband from interfering with your medical care. Given your stroke and your vulnerability, a judge would likely take this very seriously. I studied the papers, each one representing a step further away from the marriage I thought I had, and toward the independence I was discovering I needed. What about our assets? Can he prevent me from using our joint accounts for medical expenses? Not if you can demonstrate that the expenses are reasonable and necessary, which your doctor's recommendations clearly are, but given what you've told me about your separate assets, you may not need to rely on joint accounts at all. Rebecca pulled out another set of forms. I'd recommend setting up a revocable trust that gives you complete control over your separate assets and allows you to designate how medical decisions should be made if you become incapacitated. This prevents anyone else from making claims about your competence or your right to spend your own money on your own care. As I reviewed the documents, I felt a sense of empowerment I hadn't experienced in years. These weren't just legal papers, they were tools that would allow me to reclaim control over my life, my health, my future. There's one more thing, Rebecca said carefully. If your husband has been making false statements to insurance companies about your condition, that could be considered insurance fraud. If you have evidence of those conversations, you might want to document them formally. I thought about the phone calls I had overheard, David's casual dismissal of my symptoms, his strategic minimization of my needs. What kind of documentation? Recorded conversations, written statements, any? I can give them a much more accurate picture of my condition than you were able to provide. David flinched at the implied criticism, but he didn't argue. We both knew that his misrepresentations to the insurance company had been deliberate, not the result of shock or confusion. Over the next week, I threw myself into rehabilitation with the determination of someone making up for lost time. The physical therapist was a young woman named Jessica, who treated my stroke-related limitations as challenges to be overcome rather than disabilities to be accommodated. She designed a program that pushed me to work harder than I had thought possible, to regain strength and coordination through repetition and persistence. The occupational therapist, Marcus, focused on helping me adapt daily tasks to my current capabilities, while working to improve those capabilities over time. He taught me techniques for managing household tasks with limited left-hand function, but he also designed exercises to gradually restore the fine motor control I had lost. The speech therapist, Dr. Sarah Kim, was perhaps the most transformative. She helped me understand that my occasional word-finding difficulties and slight slurring were common stroke effects that could be significantly improved through targeted exercises. More importantly, she helped me rebuild confidence in my ability to communicate clearly and persuasively. David attended some of these appointments, sitting quietly in corners while I worked with my therapists. I could see him watching me struggle with tasks that had once been effortless, seeing the real impact of my stroke for the first time. His presence wasn't unwelcome, but it was no longer necessary. I was taking control of my own recovery. 3 weeks into my rehabilitation program, I was in Dr. Kim's office working on articulation exercises when her assistant knocked on the door. There was a phone call for me, she said, someone from our insurance company who needed to speak with me urgently. I took the call in Dr. Kim's private office, my heart pounding with anxiety about what new obstacle might be emerging. Ms. Empress, the voice on the phone said, "This is Jennifer Walsh from Consolidated Health Insurance. I've been reviewing your case file, and I have some concerns I need to discuss with you." My stomach dropped. What kind of concerns? We've received conflicting information about your condition and your rehabilitation needs. Initially, your husband indicated that your stroke was relatively mild, and that extensive rehabilitation services wouldn't be necessary. But recently he's reversed that position, and is now requesting comprehensive coverage for intensive therapy services. I felt a familiar anger rising, but I kept my voice level. What would you like to know from me? I need your direct assessment of your condition, your limitations, and your therapy needs. I also need to understand why there's been such a significant change in how your family is representing your case. I took a deep breath and told Jennifer Walsh the truth.
I explained the extent of my stroke-related limitations, the medical recommendations I had received, and the rehabilitation services that were helping me recover. I also explained carefully and factually that my husband had initially minimized my condition without consulting me, and that I was now managing my own healthcare decisions. Jennifer listened without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification or additional detail. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment before responding. Mrs. Harris, I have to tell you that we've seen cases like this before. Sometimes family members downplay medical conditions to avoid coverage complications, then change their position when they realize the consequence. It creates problems for us because we need accurate information to make appropriate coverage decisions. I understand that. What I can tell you is that I'm committed to following all medical recommendations for my recovery, and I'm prepared to provide whatever documentation you need to support coverage for appropriate services. That's helpful. But I also need to address another issue. We've discovered some irregularities in claims related to your husband's previous medical expenses, large charges for services that weren't clearly medically necessary, some questions about billing practices. It's made us more cautious about coverage for your family. My blood turned cold. What kind of irregularities? I can't go into specifics over the phone, but our fraud investigation unit has flagged some patterns that concern them. It may not affect your current stroke-related coverage, but it could impact your overall policy status. When I hung up the phone, my hands were shaking. David hadn't just misrepresented my condition to save money. He had apparently been involved in some kind of insurance fraud that could jeopardize our entire coverage. The man who had been so concerned about the cost of my rehabilitation had been playing games with our insurance that could result in losing our policy altogether. I called Martha from Dr. Kim's office and asked her to pick me up immediately. I needed to get home and confront David about whatever he had been doing with our insurance claims, but I also needed to protect myself from the potential consequences of his actions. Martha arrived within 20 minutes, took one look at my face and asked what had happened. I explained about the phone call, about the insurance investigation, about the possibility that David's past behavior could affect my ability to get coverage for my stroke recovery. What do you need to do? She asked. I need to call Rebecca. I need to understand what legal protections I have if David's insurance problems affect my ability to get medical care, and I need to figure out how to separate myself from whatever mess he's created. When we arrived at my house, David's truck was in the driveway, but he wasn't in any of the usual places. I found him in his office, surrounded by papers and folders, his face gray with stress. We need to talk, I said from the doorway. He looked up with the expression of someone who had been caught doing something he hoped would never be discovered. You got a call from the insurance company? I did. Jennifer Walsh wants to know about the irregularities in your previous medical claim. She wants to know about the fraud investigation. She wants to know why I should trust that my stroke coverage won't be jeopardized by whatever you've been doing behind my back. David's shoulders sagged like he was carrying a weight he could no longer bear. It's not what you think. Then explain it to me. And this time, tell me the truth. All of it. David gestured to the papers scattered across his desk. Remember when I hurt my back 3 years ago, the injury from the landscaping accident? I remember. David had been in significant pain for months, unable to work, requiring physical therapy and pain management. Our insurance had covered most of the treatment, though there had been ongoing paperwork and approvals to manage. The pain management clinic I was going to, they had a billing system that was aggressive. They would submit claims for services that were borderline necessary, treatments that were more experimental than proven. I didn't question it because I was desperate to get better. I felt a cold dread settling in my stomach. What kind of treatments? Injections that cost thousands of dollars each, diagnostic tests that were repeated more often than necessary, equipment rentals that went on for months longer than I actually used them. I thought it was normal, that this was just how pain management worked. David pulled out a thick folder and handed it to me. 6 months ago, I got a letter from the insurance company questioning some of the charges. They wanted documentation, explanations, proof that all the services had been medically necessary. I opened the folder and found correspondence between David and the insurance company, requests for information, explanations of benefits, and increasingly formal demands for documentation. It was clear that the insurance company suspected fraudulent billing and was investigating David's claims. "What did you do?" "I tried to get the documentation from the clinic, but they had closed down. Other patients were saying they had been investigated for insurance fraud, that the doctors had been submitting false claims. I realized I had been caught up in something I didn't understand." David's voice was getting quieter, more assured. "I hired a lawyer to help me respond to the insurance company's investigation. He said the best strategy was to cooperate fully, provide whatever information I could, and hope that my case would be resolved without penalties." "When was this happening?" "The investigation started 6 months ago. It's been ongoing ever since. The lawyer said it could take years to resolve, and that in the meantime our insurance status would be uncertain." I stared at David, understanding finally dawning. His obsession with minimizing my stroke-related expenses hadn't been about normal financial caution. He had been terrified that any additional claims would trigger more scrutiny from the insurance company, that my rehabilitation costs would draw attention to his pending fraud investigation. "So when I had my stroke," I said slowly, "you weren't worried about the cost of my care. You were worried that my claims would make the insurance company look more closely at your situation." David nodded miserably. "I thought if we kept your treatment minimal, if we didn't submit big claims, maybe the investigation would just go away quietly. I thought I was protecting both of us." "You thought you were protecting yourself," I corrected. "You were willing to sacrifice my recovery to avoid consequences for your own problems." "I didn't mean for it to happen that way." I was scared, confused. I didn't know what to do. I looked at this man I had been married to for 42 years, and realized I was seeing him clearly for the first time. Not just the husband who had disappointed me during my stroke, but the man who had been living with guilty knowledge for months, making decisions based on fear rather than integrity, prioritizing his own protection over my well-being. "David," I said, "you've been lying to me for months about the insurance investigation, about why you were so concerned about my medical expenses, about the real reasons you wanted to minimize my treatment. You let me think you were just being financially cautious when you were actually trying to cover up your own legal problem. I wanted to tell you, but I didn't want to worry you. You were dealing with your stroke recovery. You didn't want to tell me because you knew I would insist on handling my own medical decisions if I understood what was really going on. You knew I wouldn't let you sacrifice my health to protect yourself from an insurance investigation." David couldn't argue with that assessment, because we both knew it was true. If I had known about the fraud investigation, I would never have allowed him to minimize my stroke treatment to avoid attracting attention. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now you're going to call your lawyer and find out exactly where you stand with the insurance investigation. You're going to get a complete assessment of the potential consequences and the timeline for resolution, and you're going to figure out how to protect my access to medical coverage regardless of what happens with your case." I stood up from his desk chair, feeling exhausted by yet another revelation about David's capacity for deception. "I'm also going to call Rebecca Chen and find out what options I have for obtaining my own insurance coverage, independent of whatever mess you've created. Ginny, I know I handled this wrong, but we can work through it together." I looked at David, sitting in his office, surrounded by evidence of months of lies and cover-ups, and felt something final settle in my chest. "David, you had 6 months to tell me about this investigation. 6 months to include me in decisions that affected our insurance coverage. 6 months to prepare for the possibility that my stroke recovery might be complicated by your legal problems. Instead, you chose to handle it by yourself, in secret, in a way that put my health at risk." I walked to the office door, then turned back to face him. "I've spent the last month learning to take care of myself again after my stroke. Now I'm going to learn to take care of myself in every other way too. Because the one thing my stroke has taught me is that I can't count on you to prioritize my well-being when it conflicts with your self-interest." David started to protest, but I held up my hand to stop him. "I'll be in my room. When you've talked to your lawyer and gotten a complete picture of our situation, we can discuss how to move forward. But David, understand this. I will never again allow your problems to become obstacles to my health or my independence." That night,
I called Rebecca Chen from my private room and explained the new complications. She listened carefully, asked detailed questions about the insurance investigation and David's timeline for disclosure, and then gave me the advice I had been hoping to hear. "Miss Harris," she said, "given your husband's pattern of withholding important information and making decisions that affect your welfare, without your consent, I think it's time to consider more comprehensive protections for your independence and your resources." "What kind of protection?" "Legal separation, at minimum. Possibly a complete reorganization of your assets to insulate you from any financial consequences of his legal problems. You have enough independent wealth to secure your own insurance coverage, your own housing, your own medical care. You don't have to remain financially entangled with someone whose judgment you can't trust." As I listened to Rebecca outline my options, I felt a sense of liberation I hadn't experienced in decades. For the first time since my stroke, I was thinking not just about recovering from what had happened to me, but about building a future that would be entirely under my own control. David had made too many decisions that put his interests ahead of mine. He had withheld too much important information, made too many choices without my consent, put my recovery at risk too many times to protect himself from consequences he had helped create. It was time to stop trying to fix our marriage and start building a life that didn't require his cooperation or his approval. The next morning, I called Martha and asked her to drive me to Rebecca's office one more time. It was time to stop planning for the possibility that David would change and start planning for the certainty that I could take care of myself. Rebecca Chen's office felt different this time, less like a consultation and more like a war room where strategies were planned and executed. I sat across from her desk with a folder of documents that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of my life, papers that would free me from the constraints of a marriage that had become more prison than partnership. "Harris," Rebecca said, reviewing the separation agreement she had drafted, "this document protects your assets, your medical decision-making authority, and your right to independent housing. It also shields you from any financial liability related to your husband's insurance investigation." I studied the legal language that would translate my emotional independence into legal reality. The separation agreement established my right to live separately, to manage my own finances, to make my own medical decisions, and to pursue my recovery without interference. It also ensured that David's legal problems would remain his alone. "What about the house?" I asked. "According to the deed research we conducted, the house is jointly owned, but your separate assets are more than sufficient to buy out his share if you choose to keep it. Alternatively, you can sell it and divide the proceeds, then purchase your own residence with your independent funds." The idea of staying in the house where David had brought realtors to discuss selling it while I folded towels felt impossible. That space held too many memories of feeling powerless, too many echoes of conversations where my needs had been dismissed or minimized. "I think I'd prefer to sell it," I said. "I want a fresh start, somewhere that's entirely mine." Rebecca made notes in the margin of the agreement. "We can include a provision requiring the sale of the marital residence and equitable division of proceeds. Given your financial independence, you'll be able to purchase whatever housing suits your needs and your recovery." As we worked through the details of my legal separation, I felt a sense of empowerment that had nothing to do with my stroke recovery and everything to do with reclaiming control over my life. For 42 years I had compromised my own desires to accommodate David's preferences, deferred my own judgment to his supposed expertise, trusted his decisions even when they felt wrong to me. My stroke had revealed the cost of that trust, the danger of allowing someone else to make decisions about my welfare based on their own priorities rather than my actual needs. Now I was ensuring that would never happen again. "There's one more document I'd like you to consider," Rebecca said, sliding another set of papers across her desk, "a comprehensive advance directive that specifically addresses your concerns about future medical care." I reviewed the document, which spelled out in precise detail my preferences for medical treatment under various circumstances. It emphasized aggressive rehabilitation for any future health issues, specified that cost should never be a factor in treatment decisions when adequate resources were available, and designated Rebecca as my healthcare proxy if I became unable to advocate for myself. "This removes your husband from any medical decision-making role?" I asked. Completely. If you're incapacitated, I would consult with your physicians to ensure you receive the level of care you've specified, regardless of anyone else's opinions about cost or necessity. I signed the advance directive with a sense of profound relief. Never again would I have to worry that someone who claimed to love me might sacrifice my health for their convenience. When we finished with the legal documents, Rebecca helped me understand the practical steps for implementing my separation. I would need to notify David of my intentions, provide him with copies of the legal papers, and begin the process of dividing our shared life into two independent existences. How do you think he'll respond? Rebecca asked. I thought about David's reaction to discovering my financial independence, his shock at learning I had been building resources and making plans without his knowledge. He had seemed to assume that my stroke would make me more dependent on him, more grateful for whatever minimal support he provided, more willing to accept his version of what I needed. I think he'll be angry, and I think he'll try to convince me that I'm making a mistake, that I'm not thinking clearly, that the stroke has affected my judgment. Rebecca nodded. That's a common response when someone loses control over a situation they thought they were managing. The important thing is that you have legal protections in place now. His opinions about your competence, or your decisions, don't have any legal weight. That evening I returned home to find David waiting in the kitchen with the defeated posture of someone who had received bad news. His lawyer had clearly provided him with an update on the insurance investigation, and from his expression it wasn't encouraging. What did your attorney tell you? I asked, setting my briefcase on the counter. David looked up with eyes that seemed to have aged years in a single day. The insurance company is definitely pursuing fraud charges against the pain clinic, and they're investigating all patients who receive treatment there. My lawyer says it could take 2 years to resolve, and our coverage will remain uncertain until then. What does that mean for our policy? They're not canceling it immediately, but they're scrutinizing every claim we submit. Any expensive treatments or ongoing therapies will be subject to extra review and potential denial. I felt a familiar anger at the confirmation that David's problems would continue to threaten my access to medical care, but this time the anger was accompanied by satisfaction. I no longer needed to worry about David's insurance complications because I was about to become responsible for my own coverage. David, I said, I have something to tell you. Today I finalized arrangements for a legal separation. I'll be establishing my own residence, my own insurance coverage, and my own medical care arrangements. David's face went white. You're leaving me? I'm protecting myself from the consequences of your decision. For the second time in 2 months, I've discovered that you've been making choices that affect my welfare without consulting me. The pattern is clear and I can't continue to live with the uncertainty of not knowing what other secrets you're keeping. I opened my briefcase and handed David a copy of the separation agreement. This documents our arrangement. You'll have 30 days to review it with your attorney and sign it. If you refuse, I'll file for legal separation through the courts, which will be more expensive and more complicated for both of us. David stared at the legal documents like they were written in a foreign language. Ginny, please, I know I made mistakes, but we can work through this. We can go to counseling, we can figure out how to rebuild trust. David, you've had multiple opportunities to be honest with me, to include me in important decisions, to prioritize my well-being over your convenience. You've failed every test. My stroke, the insurance investigation, 42 years of marriage, and you still chose to manage me rather than trust me. I sat down across from him at the kitchen table where we had shared so many meals, so many conversations, so many moments that had seemed to matter at the time. Now it felt like a piece of furniture in someone else's house, a relic of a life I was ready to leave behind. I want you to understand something, I continued. This isn't a decision I'm making because I'm angry or hurt, though I am both of those things. This is a decision I'm making because I've learned that I can't trust you to act in my best interest when it conflicts with your own. David's face crumpled with the recognition that his marriage was ending not in a moment of passion or betrayal, but in the cold assessment of someone who had weighed his character and found it wanting. What about everything we've built together? 42 years of marriage, our home, our shared life. We'll divide our assets fairly according to the law. You'll get your share of everything we accumulated together. But David, most of what we built was based on my assumption that you were someone I could count. My stroke showed me that assumption was wrong. David tried several more approaches over the following weeks. He apologized repeatedly, promised to change, suggested counseling, begged for another chance. He enlisted his brother to call me, convinced our pastor to visit and talk about the sanctity of marriage, even had his sister write me a letter about the importance of forgiveness. But none of these interventions addressed the fundamental issue. David had demonstrated repeatedly that when faced with difficult decisions, he would prioritize his own interests over mine, and make choices about my life without my consent. No amount of counseling could change the fact that I could no longer trust his judgment about my welfare. 6 weeks after I presented David with the separation agreement, I moved into a condominium I had purchased with my independent fund. The condo was in a newer development specifically designed for active seniors, with accessible features that would accommodate any future mobility issues, and a community center that offered fitness classes adapted for people recovering from health challenges. My new home was smaller than the house I had shared with David, but it was entirely mine. I decorated it with furniture I chose myself, colors I preferred, artwork that reflected my taste rather than our compromise aesthetic. For the first time in decades, my living space reflected my personality rather than the intersection of two people's preferences. The rehabilitation services I had been receiving continued seamlessly, funded by the private insurance policy I had purchased through my own resources. My physical therapy progressed to the point where I could manage all activities of daily living independently. My speech therapy eliminated the last traces of slurring and word-finding difficulty. My occupational therapy helped me adapt to the subtle changes in my cognitive processing, while building strategies to compensate for any lingering deficits. More importantly, I was discovering capabilities I had forgotten I possessed. Living independently after my stroke required me to be more organized, more proactive, more self-reliant than I had been during my marriage. Instead of limiting me, these requirements empowered me. 3 months after moving into my condo, I received a call that would provide the final vindication of my decision to leave David. Jennifer Walsh from Consolidated Health Insurance wanted to update me on the resolution of the fraud investigation.
Mrs. Harris, she said, I wanted to let you know that the investigation into your husband's medical claims has been concluded. The insurance company has determined that while he was a victim of fraudulent billing practices, his failure to report suspicious charges and his attempts to minimize scrutiny during our investigation constitute a breach of his policy obligations. My heart sank despite my separation from David. What does that mean for his coverage? His policy has been canceled and he's been placed on a list that will make it very difficult for him to obtain coverage from other carriers. The good news is that because you've established independent coverage, this doesn't affect your access to medical care. I felt a complex mixture of vindication and sadness. My decision to separate our insurance coverage had protected me from exactly this consequence, but David was now facing the reality of being uninsured in his 60s, when medical needs were most likely to arise. There's something else, Jennifer continued. During our investigation, we discovered that your husband had been contacted multiple times by our fraud prevention unit about suspicious charges. He had opportunities to report the clinic's practices and chose not to. In fact, he continued to schedule appointments and submit claims even after receiving warnings about potential fraud. This revelation hit me harder than I expected. David hadn't just been a naive victim of fraudulent billing, he had been an active participant who had ignored warnings and continued to submit questionable claims. His supposed ignorance about the clinic's practices had been willful blindness motivated by his desire to continue receiving expensive treatments. Mrs. Harris, I have to say that your decision to establish independent insurance coverage was very wise. If you had remained on his policy, you would have lost coverage along with him. When I hung up the phone, I sat in my sunny living room, looking out at the community garden I had helped plant, surrounded by furniture I had chosen, and books I was finally finding time to read, and felt the deep satisfaction of someone who had made difficult decisions that had proven to be absolutely necessary. David called me that evening to tell me about losing his insurance coverage. His voice was shaken, frightened in a way I had never heard before. He asked if there was any way he could be added to my policy, if my lawyer could help him appeal the insurance company's decision, if I thought our separation could be reconsidered given his new circumstances. David, I said gently, I'm sorry you're facing this situation, but this is exactly why I needed to protect myself legally and financially. Your problems have been ongoing for months, and you kept making choices that could have affected my access to medical care. I didn't know it would get this bad, he said. You didn't want to know. There's a difference. You received warnings. You had opportunities to address the situation, honestly, and you chose to handle it in a way that put both of us at risk. David was quiet for a long moment. I've been seeing a counselor, he said finally, trying to understand why I made the decisions I did, why I thought I could manage everything myself without including you. That's good, David. I hope it helps you. She says I have control issues, that I was so afraid of appearing weak or uncertain that I made things worse by trying to handle problems I didn't understand. I appreciated his honesty, but it came too late to change the trajectory we were on. David, I believe you're sincere about wanting to change, but change takes time, and trust takes even longer to rebuild. I can't base my future on the possibility that you might become someone different. So this is permanent, the separation, the divorce, everything. I looked around my condo, at the life I had built for myself in the months since my stroke, at the independence I had reclaimed, and the self-reliance I had rediscovered. David, for the first time in decades, I'm living a life that's entirely my own choice. I'm making decisions based on what I need and want, not on what someone else thinks is best for me. I'm not willing to give that up. David accepted the finality in my voice, though I could hear his disappointment. We talked for a few more minutes about practical matters, the final details of dividing our shared belongings, the timeline for selling our house, the logistics of ending 42 years of shared life. When we hung up, I didn't feel sad or regretful. I felt 6 months later, I was having coffee with Martha in the community center of my condo complex, telling her about the adaptive yoga class I had started attending and the book club I had joined. My speech was completely normal, my mobility fully restored, my cognitive function better than it had been before my stroke. You look happier than I've seen you in years, Martha said. I feel happier than I've been in years. It's amazing what happens when you stop trying to accommodate someone else's limitations and start focusing on your own possibilities, Martha smiled. Any regrets about the divorce? The divorce had been finalized 2 months earlier, a quiet legal proceeding that formalized what had already become our reality. David had signed all the papers without contest, accepting the settlement that gave him half of our joint assets, while leaving my independent wealth untouched. No regrets, I said. I learned something important from my stroke. I learned that when you're at your most vulnerable, you find out who people really are. David showed me that he was someone who would sacrifice my well-being for his convenience. Once I saw that clearly, staying married to him would have been a betrayal of myself. Martha nodded. What about the future? Any thoughts about dating, remarriage, any of that? I laughed, surprised by how foreign those concepts sounded. I'm 67 years old, Martha. I just learned how to live independently after 42 years of marriage. I think I'd like to explore that for a while before I consider sharing my life with anyone else. But you're not ruling it out completely. I'm not ruling anything out, but I'm also not looking for anything. For the first time in my adult life, I'm complete on my own. If someone comes along who adds to that completeness rather than requiring me to diminish it, maybe I'd be interested. But my days of accommodating someone else's need for control are over. As we sat in the community center surrounded by other residents who were building lives of purpose and independence in their later years, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. My stroke had initially felt like a catastrophe, a medical emergency that threatened to diminish my capabilities and limit my future. Instead, it had become the catalyst for the most empowering transformation of my life. By forcing me to confront David's true character and priorities, my stroke had freed me from a marriage that had been constraining me in ways I hadn't fully recognized. The woman who had collapsed in her kitchen 9 months earlier, who had trusted her husband to advocate for her recovery, who had believed that 42 years of marriage guaranteed loyalty and support, was gone. In her place was someone stronger, more self-reliant, more aware of her own worth and more protective of her own interests. I had not just recovered from my stroke, I had recovered from the diminished version of myself that I had become during my marriage. The rehabilitation that mattered most wasn't physical or cognitive, it was the reclamation of my own authority over my life. That evening I sat on my balcony watching the sunset over the community garden, surrounded by the sounds of other residents enjoying their evening activity. I thought about David, probably struggling with his insurance problems and facing his health challenges without the safety net he had taken for granted. I felt compassion for his situation, but no responsibility for it. I thought about the woman I had been before my stroke, accommodating and deferential, always putting David's preferences ahead of my own, trusting his judgment even when it conflicted with my instinct. That woman had served her purpose, but she had also limited my possibilities in ways I was only now beginning to understand. I thought about the future, about the years ahead, that would be entirely my own to shape and direct. I had resources to travel, to pursue interests I had set aside during my marriage, to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than accommodation. I had health insurance that couldn't be jeopardized by someone else's poor decisions, financial independence that couldn't be threatened by someone else's problems, and living space that reflected my preferences rather than our compromise. Most importantly, I had learned that I could trust my own judgment, that I could take care of myself through crisis and change, that I could make difficult decisions and live with their consequences. My stroke had taught me that vulnerability and strength weren't opposites, they were conditions that could coexist, that could even reinforce each other when you had the right support systems in place. As I prepared for bed in my own space, surrounded by my own choices, accountable only to my own conscience, I felt grateful for the crisis that had forced me to discover who I really was underneath 42 years of being who someone else needed me to be. My stroke had taken some things from me, but it had given me something far more valuable, the knowledge that I was strong enough to survive anything, including the loss of the life I thought I wanted, and brave enough to build the life I actually needed. David had been wrong about many things, but he had been most wrong about me. I wasn't the fragile, dependent woman he had tried to manage during my recovery. I was the competent, resourceful woman who had quietly built financial independence while maintaining a marriage, who had navigated complex legal and medical systems while recovering from a brain injury, who had recognized when a relationship was harming rather than helping her, and had the courage to end it. The next morning, I woke up in my own bed, in my own home, ready to spend another day, living a life that was entirely my own choice, and for the first time in decades, that felt like exactly what I wanted. 2 years after my divorce was finalized, I received an unexpected phone call that would test everything I had learned about forgiveness, boundaries, and the complex nature of human relationships. The caller identified herself as Patricia Morrison, and the name took me a moment to place before I realized she was the daughter of Linda Morrison, the woman David had his affair with 5 years earlier. "Harris," Patricia said, her voice hesitant and apologetic, "I know this is unusual, but I'm calling because my mother is dying, and she asked me to contact you." I sat down heavily in my favorite chair, the one positioned to catch the morning light in my living room, and tried to process this unexpected intrusion from my past. "I'm sorry to hear about your mother's condition," I said carefully, "but I'm not sure why she would want to speak with me." Patricia's voice became more strained. "She has pancreatic cancer. The doctors say she has maybe 2 weeks left. She's been carrying guilt about the affair with your husband, and she wants to apologize to you before she dies. She says she can't leave this world knowing she hurt you and never tried to make it right." The request hung between us like a bridge I could choose to cross or ignore. Part of me wanted to hang up immediately, to protect the peace I had built from this unwelcome reminder of David's betrayal. But another part of me was curious about what Linda Morrison might have to say, what perspective she might offer on events that had shaped my life in ways she couldn't have imagined. "Where is she?" I asked. Patricia gave me the name of a hospice facility about an hour's drive from my condo. We arranged for me to visit the following afternoon, and I spent the rest of that day wondering what I hoped to gain from this encounter and what I might be risking by reopening old wounds. When I arrived at the hospice, Linda Morrison was barely recognizable as the woman I had seen in those private investigator photographs years earlier. Cancer had reduced her to a frail figure in a hospital bed,
her skin pale and papery, her once thick hair now wispy and gray. But her eyes were alert and focused when I entered her room. "Virginia," she said, her voice weak but clear. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." I sat in the chair beside her bed, studying this woman who had been an abstract concept in my life for so long, a symbol of David's betrayal rather than a real person with her own story and motivations. "Your daughter said you wanted to apologize," I said. "I'm here to listen." Linda closed her eyes for a moment, gathering her strength. "I need you to know that I didn't know you existed when David and I first started seeing each other. He told me he was divorced, that he had been single for several years. I believed him because I wanted to believe." This revelation hit me unexpectedly hard. David hadn't just been unfaithful, he had been systematically dishonest with both of us, creating an entirely false narrative about his life to pursue his affair. "When did you find out he was married?" I asked. "About 2 months into our relationship. I saw a wedding ring tan line on his finger and asked him about it. He admitted he was still married, but said you were separated, that the divorce was just a formality that hadn't been finalized yet." I felt a familiar anger rising, not at Linda but at David's capacity for deception. He had lied to her just as comprehensively as he had lied to me, creating a fictional reality that served his desires without regard for the consequences to either of us. "I should have ended things then," Linda continued, but David was very convincing. "He said you two had grown apart, that you were living separate lives, that ending the marriage was just a matter of time and paperwork. He made it sound like I wasn't really breaking up a functioning relationship, but you eventually learned the truth." Linda nodded slowly. "I started noticing things that didn't match his story. He was never available on weekends, never on holidays, never on any of the times when a separated man would be most free. When I pressed him about it, he admitted that you didn't know about the separation, that he was waiting for the right time to tell you." I could see the weight of guilt in Linda's expression, the burden she had carried for years about her role in David's deception. But I could also see that she had been a victim of his dishonesty in her own way. "How long did it continue after you knew the truth?" I asked. 3 more months. I kept thinking he would actually leave you, that he would follow through on his promise, but it became clear that he had no intention of ending his marriage. He wanted to keep both of us, to have a wife and a girlfriend without having to choose between them." Linda paused. Her breathing labored from the effort of speaking. "I ended it when I realized he was never going to be honest with either of us. I told him I wouldn't be part of his lies anymore, that he needed to either commit to his marriage or end it, but I wouldn't continue being his secret." This conversation was providing me with insights into David's character that I had never possessed, a fuller picture of his capacity for compartmentalization and deception. He hadn't just been unfaithful, he had been methodically dishonest with everyone involved, crafting separate realities for each relationship. "Virginia," Linda said, "I know my apology can't undo the hurt I contributed to, but I need you to know that I never intended to destroy your marriage. I thought I was getting involved with someone who was already ending his relationship, not someone who was actively deceiving his wife." I looked at this dying woman, ravaged by cancer and guilt, and felt something unexpected, compassion. She had been manipulated by David just as I had, led to believe a version of reality that served his purposes rather than reflecting the truth. "Linda," I said, "I appreciate you telling me this. It helps me understand what really happened, how extensive David's deceptions. You weren't the villain in this story, you were another one of his victims." Linda's eyes filled with tears. "I've carried the guilt for years, thinking I had helped destroy a happy marriage. Learning that he lied to me too doesn't excuse my choices, but it helps me understand how I got drawn into something I never intended to be part of." We talked for another hour, Linda sharing details about David's behavior during their affair that revealed patterns I had been blind to in our marriage. He had been secretive about his finances with her too, vague about his business dealings, controlling about when and where they could meet. The man she had known was recognizably the same person who had tried to manage my stroke recovery without my input. When I left the hospice that afternoon, I felt something I hadn't expected, relief. Not relief that Linda was dying, but relief at finally understanding the full scope of David's dishonesty. For years I had wondered what I had done wrong in our marriage, what failures on my part had driven him to seek intimacy elsewhere. Now I understood that his affair had been about his character, not about deficiencies in our relationship. Linda Morrison died 6 days later. I attended her funeral, sitting in the back of a small chapel filled with people who had known her as a devoted mother and community volunteer. Her daughter Patricia approached me afterward, thanking me for visiting her mother and for the peace my forgiveness had given her in her final days. She said talking to you helped her understand that she wasn't as guilty as she thought. Patricia, she realized she had been deceived too, that the real betrayal was my father's dishonesty with both of you. Driving home from the funeral, I reflected on how this unexpected encounter had provided closure I hadn't realized I needed. Learning about David's systematic deceptions during his affair had actually strengthened my confidence in my decision to leave him. If he could lie so comprehensively to both his wife and his girlfriend, if he could maintain separate false realities for months without apparent conscience, then he was capable of deceptions I might never discover. 6 months after Linda's death, I was surprised to receive another call from Patricia Morrison. This time, however, she wasn't calling about her mother's guilt or her need for forgiveness. "Miss Harris?" she said. "I'm calling because I think you should know that your ex-husband has been contacting me. He found out somehow that my mother had talked to you before she died, and he's been asking me what she told you." I felt a chill of unease. What kind of questions is he asking? He wants to know if she mentioned anything about money, about financial arrangements they might have had, about whether she kept any records of their relationship. It's making me uncomfortable because it sounds like he's worried about something specific. This was troubling for several reasons. David and I had been divorced for over a year, our assets divided according to the legal settlement. He shouldn't have any reason to be concerned about what Linda might have revealed about their affair, unless there were aspects of that relationship I still didn't know about. "Patricia, did your mother mention anything about financial arrangements with David during our conversation?" "No, but that doesn't mean there weren't any. After she died, I found some papers in her personal effects that I didn't understand. Bank statements for an account I didn't know she had, deposit records that didn't match her work income, some correspondence with lawyers about something called asset protection." My stomach dropped. If David had been providing financial support to Linda during their affair, if he had been using our joint resources to fund his relationship with another woman, then our divorce settlement might have been based on incomplete information about our marital asset. "Patricia, would you be willing to let me review those papers? If David was using marital funds to support your mother, I may have legal grounds to reopen our financial settlement." We arranged to meet the following week, and Patricia brought me a box of documents that painted a disturbing picture of David's financial arrangements during his affair. Bank statements showed regular monthly deposits to an account in Linda's name, totaling over $50,000 during the course of their relationship. Legal correspondence indicated that David had consulted attorneys about protecting these payments from discovery during any potential divorce proceeding. Most damaging was a series of emails between David and Linda discussing the financial security he was providing her and his assurances that these payments would continue as long as their relationship lasted. The emails made clear that David had been using our joint savings to fund what amounted to a financial arrangement with his girlfriend. I took these documents to Rebecca Chen, who reviewed them with the focused attention of someone who had seen many forms of marital financial deception. "Miss Harris," she said, "this is clear evidence of dissipation of marital assets. Your ex-husband used joint funds to support another woman during your marriage, then failed to disclose these expenditures during your divorce proceedings. You have grounds to petition the court for a revised settlement." The legal process took 8 months, during which David's attorneys tried every possible argument to avoid accountability for his hidden expenditure. They claimed the payments to Linda were business loans, personal gifts, unrelated to their affair, compensation for consulting services she had allegedly provided to his landscaping company. But the emails Patricia had provided demolished these defenses. David's own words, written during his affair, made clear that the payments were connected to their romantic relationship, and represented a form of financial support he was providing in exchange for her continued involvement with him. The court ultimately ruled that David had dissipated marital assets by using joint funds to support his affair, and had committed fraud by concealing these expenditures during our divorce proceeding. He was ordered to pay me an additional settlement of $75,000 plus interest and legal fees. More satisfying than the financial award was the formal recognition that David's deceptions had extended far beyond his sexual infidelity. The court's findings documented his pattern of using our shared resources for his personal benefit, while lying about his actions, a pattern that had continued throughout our marriage and into our divorce proceedings. During the legal proceedings, I learned more about David's current circumstance. His insurance problems had indeed made it difficult for him to obtain medical coverage, and he had been forced to pay cash for several medical procedures related to his back problem. His landscaping business had suffered as potential clients learned about his insurance fraud issues, and he had been forced to significantly reduce his operation. I felt no satisfaction in his struggles, but I did feel vindicated in my decision to separate my financial future from him. If I had remained married to him, his insurance problems would have affected my access to medical care, his business difficulties would have threatened our shared financial security, and his pattern of deception might have continued to jeopardize our resources in ways I couldn't predict or prevent. The final hearing in our financial dispute was held on a gray December morning in a courthouse I had hoped never to see again. David sat at the defendant's table looking older and more defeated than I had ever seen him, while I sat with Rebecca feeling strong and prepared. When the judge announced his ruling in my favor, David turned to look at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, anger, certainly, but also something that might have been regret or even respect. He had spent our entire marriage assuming that I was too trusting to question his decisions, too financially naive to understand his deceptions, too emotionally dependent to challenge his authority. My stroke had forced both of us to discover that all of those assumptions were wrong. After the hearing, David approached me in the courthouse hallway. "Ginny," he said, "I want you to know that I never intended for things to turn out this way." I looked at this man I had been married to for 42 years, who had shared my bed and my dreams and my daily life for most of my adult years, and felt nothing but mild curiosity about what he might say next. "David," I replied, "you've said that before, about the affair, about the insurance problems, about minimizing my stroke care. You never intend for things to turn out badly, but you keep making choices that ensure they do." He nodded slowly, accepting the truth of that assessment. "I suppose you're happier now, living alone, being independent." "I'm not happier because I'm living alone," I said. "I'm happier because I'm living honestly. No one is making decisions about my life based on hidden agendas or undisclosed problems. No one is managing my information or controlling my choices for my own supposed good. I know exactly where I stand and I trust the person making decisions about my future." David seemed to understand that this was a final conversation, that whatever had existed between us was truly finished. "I hope you have a good life, Ginny. I hope you get everything you want." "I already have everything I want," I said. "I have my health, my independence, my financial security, and my peace of mind. Those are the things that matter to me now." As I watched David walk away across the courthouse parking lot, I felt the deep satisfaction of someone who had fought for justice and won. Not just the financial settlement, though that was important, but the larger victory of refusing to accept someone else's version of what my life should look like. My stroke had initially seemed like a catastrophe that would diminish my capabilities and limit my future. Instead, it had become the catalyst for discovering strengths I didn't know I possessed and reclaiming authority over my life that I had gradually surrendered during my marriage. The woman who had collapsed in her kitchen 3 years earlier, who had trusted her husband to advocate for her recovery, who had believed that 42 years of marriage guaranteed loyalty and support, was gone. In her place was someone who had learned to trust her own judgment, protect her own interests, and build a life that reflected her own values, rather than someone else's convenience. Standing in that courthouse parking lot, financially vindicated, and legally free from the last remnants of my marriage to David, I felt the profound peace that comes from knowing you have fought for yourself and won. My stroke had taken some things from me, but it had given me something far more valuable, the knowledge that I was strong enough to survive anything, and brave enough to demand the life I deserved. That evening, I called Martha to tell her about the court's ruling and the additional settlement I had been awarded. She listened with the satisfaction of someone who had watched a friend fight a long battle and finally achieve victory. "What will you do with the money?" she asked. I looked around my condo, at the life I had built for myself through careful planning and determined independence, and smiled. "I think I'll travel," I said. "There are places I always wanted to see but never got to visit, because David didn't think they were worth the expense, or the effort. Now I can go wherever I want, stay as long as I like, and make all the decisions about what's worth my time and money." As I planned my future travels and considered the adventures that lay ahead, I reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought me to this point. My stroke had seemed like an ending when it happened, a medical crisis that threatened to diminish my independence and limit my possibilities. Instead, it had been a beginning, the first step in a process of discovering who I really was underneath 42 years of being who someone else needed me to be. I had not just recovered from my stroke, I had recovered myself, and that, I realized, was the greatest victory of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.